How do you hold people accountable without micromanaging them? Because if you're constantly checking every decision, chasing every task, and approving every move they make, you are not creating accountability. What you're creating is dependence. And I know exactly what that feels like because I've worked for a manager who did it. That experience taught me something that I've carried into every leadership role I've held since. You can give people enormous freedom and still hold them accountable. In fact, done properly, more autonomy can create more accountability, not less. The key is knowing what to control and what to let go. I'm Bryan. I've spent more than 30 years leading teams, and I've experienced micromanagement from both sides, as the manager responsible for results, and later as the leader deciding how much authority to give my own people. At the time, I was managing a field sales team. 10 people reported directly to me. I was responsible for coaching them, supporting them, developing them, and ultimately delivering the team's results. Everything you would normally expect from a frontline manager. But there was just one problem. I wasn't really allowed to manage. I had a manager above me, and let me be clear, he was not a bad person. He cared about the business, he cared about his people, and he wanted good results. But he also wanted to check almost every decision made by his direct reports. Sound familiar? Customer decisions, commercial decisions, staff decisions, operational decisions, almost everything flowed through one person. So imagine what happened. One of my team would come to me with a problem. I'd understand the issue. I'd know how I wanted to resolve it. There'd be good commercial reasons behind that too, and I would be responsible for the outcome. But instead of making the decision, I would have to ask permission. And then we'd wait. Sometimes the answer would come back in a day. Sometimes it would come back in a week. Occasionally longer. Meanwhile, the customer's waiting. My team was waiting. The opportunity was waiting, and so was I, but they don't wait forever. And that's when I learned a lesson that I think every leader needs to understand. You can't make someone genuinely accountable for an outcome if you don't give them enough authority to influence it. Think about that. I was accountable for the result, but somebody else controlled the decisions required to achieve it. It's incredibly frustrating, not just for me, but for my team. The delays, though, weren't actually the worst part. Something else started happening. People became hesitant. We started second-guessing ourselves. And instead of thinking, what's the best decision here? We began thinking, what decision will get approved? And those are two very different questions. And over time, something quite dangerous happens. People stop deciding. They wait, they ask, they escalate. But eventually, what's going on is the behavior, exactly the behavior that you didn't want. One of the ideas you'll hear me come back to throughout the Long Way Forward podcast is this. People respond to what you repeatedly reward. As a leader, people respond to what you reward. If every decision has to come back to the manager, you're rewarding dependence. You're teaching people that asking permission is safer than using judgment. And if that happens for long, if it happens for long enough, don't be surprised when people stop taking initiative. But with all of that, here's what really got my attention. I started noticing something beyond my team. This particular business unit had significantly higher staff turnover than almost every other region in the country. But at first, I didn't connect the two. Looking back now, I don't think it was a coincidence. Because the people who become most frustrated in that kind of environment are often the very people you want to keep. They've got confidence. They've got ideas, good ones too. These are people who want to solve problems and they want to make a difference. You give those people responsibility, but take away their authority for long enough, and eventually what they ask themselves, why am I here? So I don't think it was necessarily workload driving people away. It wasn't the customers, it wasn't the targets, it wasn't the business. It was a great brand. It was the feeling that you couldn't make a meaningful contribution without somebody else's permission. And once I saw that, I knew I did not want to lead that way. So when I began leading my own teams, stepping aside from that environment, and yes, I left eventually for the same reason, but when I began leading different teams, I developed a different approach. I still want accountability. That's a must. Absolutely. But I don't confuse accountability with control. And this is the tool I really want you to put in your leadership toolbox today. And a toolbox, by the way, this is a technique, and we'll call your leadership toolbox your toolbox of techniques. And this is a tool for that toolbox. Define the outcome. So listen up. Define the outcome. Define the boundaries. Then give people room to move. That's it. When somebody works for me, I want them to understand three things. What outcome are you responsible for? What standards and boundaries apply? And which decisions genuinely need to come back to me? Once those things are clear, go. Use your judgment. Solve the problem. Make the decision. Own the outcome and be proud. I don't need to approve every step. I need to know that we're heading towards the right outcome. That's what I need to know. Now, people will occasionally make a decision differently from how I would have made it. That's no problem. Of course, that's going to happen. They'll do things differently. But here's a question leaders need to become comfortable with. Does it have to be done my way to be done well? These aren't necessarily the same thing. Sometimes my team will make a decision differently, and they will be right. Sometimes their way will actually be better. And that's how I learn too, and that's how our business improves. Other times they'll get it wrong. Then we course correct, depending on the outcome, of course, but we course correct. We talk about what happened. What did you see? What were you trying to achieve? And what would you do differently next time? Notice that's coaching. That's not anything other than good old-fashioned coaching. And every one of those conversations adds another tool to their toolbox. Because my job as a leader is not to create people who perfectly follow my instructions. My job is not to create a bunch of robots or clones. It's to create people who can think, people who can exercise judgment, and they can make increasingly good decisions without needing me standing over their shoulder. Now, if you're getting value from these conversations, please consider subscribing. I'm building a practical leadership toolbox here, one lesson and one real-world experience at a time. I also share these insights on LinkedIn, so if you'd like to see some more of this kind of thinking or understand a bit more about me, feel free to connect with me there. Now, there's an obvious objection to all of this free thinking and free decision making. There's an obvious objection. Here it is. Bryan, surely there needs to be some decisions that the leader needs to control. Absolutely. Autonomy is not anarchy. There are always boundaries. Large financial commitments, legal matters, safety issues, major customer risks, strategic decisions, anything outside someone's level of authority. Notice I use those words, level of authority. The important part, though, is that those boundaries, those things that are outside someone's level of authority, that needs to be known before the decision needs to be made. It needs to be clear. People need to understand their limits so they can work safely within them. And that's what my earlier experience had been missing. If people know you can make decisions up to here, and beyond here involve me, they can move quickly and confidently. They're not wondering whether they're allowed to act. They know. That creates speed, it creates confidence, and best of all, it creates ownership. And with that, you get a much better morale because people feel trusted. Sound good? You bet. It happens not because you've told them, I trust you, but because your behavior proves it. And here's something else I've learned. Micromanagement isn't just slow, it's contagious. Ugh, that's not good. If a senior leader micromanages their managers, those managers start micromanaging their supervisors. And the supervisors, you guessed it, they start micromanaging their teams. And before long, you've got an entire organisation waiting for permission. Everybody's busy. There are meetings everywhere, emails everywhere, approval processes everywhere. But decisions move at a snail's pace. That's not accountability. That's a bottleneck. And eventually, what happens to that business is that they become dependent on a handful of people who make almost every meaningful decision. Have you worked at a business like that? I have. Gosh, and it was right, very slow, getting things happening. But what happens when they're busy? Everything slows down when those people are busy. When they're away, what happens? Everything stops. That is not a strong organisation. A strong organisation has people throughout it who understand the outcome. They understand their authority and they are capable of making good decisions. And that's how you build a nimble business. Everybody knows what their limits are, they work within them, and they're capable of making good decisions. Here's a paradox. The more effectively you delegate authority, the easier accountability becomes. So let's be a bit careful with that. When I say the more effectively you delegate authority, doesn't mean getting everybody else to do things. The key word there is effective, making sure people understand the boundaries and the limits. The more effectively you delegate that authority, the easier accountability becomes. Make sense? Of course it does, because now the conversation is clear. We agreed on the outcome. You understood the boundaries. You had the authority to act. So now we can look at what happened. What worked? What didn't? What did we learn? What needs to change? And if you look at it through that lens, accountability becomes a conversation about outcomes, behaviours, and choices, rather than when somebody followed every instruction. And that is a much healthier form of accountability. It's much better leadership. So here's the tool again. In case you missed it the first time around, here is the tool for your leadership toolbox. Define the outcome. Define the boundaries. Give them room to move, and then inspect the result. Coach the decisions, and course correct where or if necessary. And gradually step back. Not straight away, it's not hands off immediately, gradually step back. Because leadership is not about making yourself indispensable. Leadership is about building people who don't need you involved in every decision. Trust me, it's very freeing. If you can conjure that up, you've done well. Here's a question for you to reflect on for this episode. I'd like you to ask yourself, what decision am I still making that someone in my team could make just as well without me? And then ask the harder question, what am I teaching? What am I teaching them every time I insist that decision comes back to me? Because if we want people to take ownership, we've got to give them something meaningful to own. Here's something that one of my best leaders taught me back in the day. He said, Bryan, you need to understand that between you and I, there is almost no decision that I can make that you cannot make also. It's a pretty bold statement, and right then I realised he had confidence in me. But what he was telling me directly was, don't be frightened of making decisions. Because if you make a good decision and I support you, then all you've done is save me time and you've made our business faster. I love working for that manager. He was fantastic. Now, in the next episode, what have we got lined up? We are going to look at the other side of accountability, because giving people authority is one thing, but having the courage to challenge them when standards aren't being met is another. So that episode is, why does holding people accountable feel so uncomfortable? And it can, because it's not an easy conversation. And what can happen to an entire team when the leader keeps avoiding that conversation? We'll tackle that next time, but until then, keep building your toolbox. This is the long way forward. Thank you.